our other students. But if I do that, I'll do that with your permission. So if we talk about something today and you're like, I don't want that out to everyone, I'm more than glad to edit it. So
Okay.
yeah.
All
Well,
right.
I'm glad you're in the course, and this has been a really weird semester. I think it's the first time it's ever happened to where no one comes on the Zooms. So I sent it out to people and said, "Hey, I'm willing to change the time," and I didn't get very many responses back, and those that I did get the times to work. So I just said I'm available. So I'm glad you took me up on my offer.
No, yeah, I got in a little, I think I came in about a week or two late from when it officially got started. I don't know. I just happened to think, oh, I'll do this course. And then I realized that besides self-study, it had where you could be online with others. I'm like, oh, that would be even better because I would learn more that way. So then I asked, hey, can you get me into the out of the self-study, self-paced, whatever. And so, yeah, so I would have shown up for Zooms, but I guess I would have been the only one, but I have a very
Practically
flexible,
speaking, it's kind of become a self-paced, hasn't it?
I guess. I mean, I'm trying to stay on the
Yes.
schedule, but
Yeah.
probably a week behind, but I'm also taking biblical Greek through the Biblical Mastery Academy. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not.
I'm not. Where is that at?
It's all
Or
online. It's
who is it through?
Daryl Burling.
Okay.
And he's got a YouTube channel. He is but I mean he is started it as a program for anybody who wanted to be able to read biblical Greek for the purpose of devotionally, just to read the Bible in Greek. But he has lots of pastors that are a part of his program who, when they were going through seminary, because you apparently, I don't know this, I didn't go to seminary, but I guess you go through the Greek really fast and you don't necessarily keep up with it. And so he has a lot of people coming in who are pastors who are like, yeah, I want to actually uh get better at the Greek.
Good.
So anyway, but he they do Hebrew and Greek. So they have Hebrew and
So does he teach both of them?
I know he teaches the Greek. I don't know if he teaches the Hebrew. I know he teaches Greek because I'm in one of his cohorts. There's another man named Neil Ellison, who's in the UK, and he leads cohorts. And Daryl is in New Zealand. So it's people all over the place. And
Okay.
so, but
Cool.
anyway, I started with the Greek, and with my intention being I want to find a hermeneutics course so that I can, because there's obviously the language, and there's different, learning the language is one thing, but just to learn how to read the Bible and interpret it correctly. Because I've been in so many Bible studies, and including like precept and all the inductive studies, and I just was like, okay, they're still telling me what to think. They're still telling me I mean, they're not really teaching me how to study. They're basically calling it a Bible study, but it's like, here's what we expect, like here, we're telling you, you go and learn this yourself, but we're still going to basically tell you what to believe at the end, of all this. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, your questions online I'm looking forward to this conversation because the questions you're asking are the ones that I enjoy. And I really like what you just said because in my course, and it's part of the gap when it's an online thing and we don't get this kind of interaction is I like to challenge people to think through the why.
Mhm.
Yeah, we'll get to how do you read things in its historical cultural context. We'll talk about literary context. We'll get to how to do exegesis, but I want you to think through the why because if you can kind of start rethinking why, if you start thinking about what's actually guiding you and more, because hermeneutics ultimately is a lens, right? But hermeneutics are ultimately, you could say it like this: the principles behind the actual what we do. So I think I talk about in the video, like you don't hermeneuticalize the Bible. Like it's hermeneutics are that which is guiding when you open up and read. Why do you read it this way versus someone else reading it a different way? Why do you interpret it this way versus someone else interpreting it that way? Ultimately, it's that step back why that is hermeneutics. And of course, I would, if your experience is anything like mine, which I've been teaching this for 21 years now, most people don't talk about hermeneutics in the church. Like that's not a something they're talking. The other day I was in a hermeneutics class in my church, but yet we're all saying we're about the scriptures.
Mhm.
It just becomes like you said, who tells me what to do? Or maybe they just model it a particular way. So you just kind of go, well, if that's the way pastor or whoever does it, then I'm going to do it that way instead of kind of thinking through why. So what I'm trying to do in this class is kind of blend those back to a much more what I would consider a much more ancient way of interpreting the scriptures while at the same time learning how to do the actual work of exegesis. And that um, I could easily turn this into a 2 semester course. So we're trying to do it all in one and
This is
doing it from a distance, right? So
Yeah, it's very challenging. It's reminding me when I had to take regular chemistry, organic chemistry, and biochemistry all at the same time.
oh
Um,
yes, yes.
I don't
Yeah,
recommend it.
hermeneutics and Greek together while they go together, that's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah, I kind of felt like it was with the Greek because we're getting in like we were just doing this translation because we're already, working through translation is kind of how you learn, but it's like been kind of vetted where Daryl creates these takes these scriptures like, well, here's the majority of the vocabulary I've given you so far, but I'll put in the parts you don't have so you can try to translate. But like literally talking about, well, do we add the word men in here because he's talking about all men, but it doesn't actually say men, but it might be
Mhm.
implied, and it doesn't mean it doesn't mean creation and animals. I mean, people are like getting into like these really nitty-gritty things, and I'm like, wow, like this is very different from coming in and trying to go like, let's just look at the whole picture and like let's
Yeah.
just talk about our what method and the lens within we look through. Like when it's the grammar and you're just dissecting that, it's a very different, it's just a whole nother part of your brain you're using there. So
Well,
it's
and I think a lot of people, I mean, I've got a lot of biblical languages in me. I that was kind of my area of emphasis in seminary was biblical languages and exegesis. And what I think people think, oh, if I take the original languages, I'll know how to really interpret the scriptures. And what you realize is that language just involves exegesis interpretation just as much as doing it from English. The advantage is you're taking out the English part of it and you're kind of going back and thinking about it from the language of the way they're saying it and referencing it. And so good for you. I've taught that before. It's a lot of fun to teach. It's also challenging. And I taught it through eternity one time, and it was fun. Those students were fun, but
Mhm.
it's a challenge because I don't know what your brain was like, but language is a whole different beast, like you said.
Yeah, and I don't have any background in any kind of other language, so yeah, I was really like, and I haven't taken English grammar. I turned 50 this year, and I haven't taken English grammar since seventh or eighth grade, so that was a long time ago, and I was literally going back, I think I need to brush up on some English grammar, because we're having to turn this Greek into English, and you have to understand English grammar. So it's just like, yeah, it's a lot.
I I think I talk about it one of the videos, maybe not. So if I do repeat, but I'd had a year of Greek, Hebrew, and I was in a Hebrew exegesis course talking about participles and infinitive. And I'm like, I have no idea what those are. And it was an English grammar class that I flunked pre-test going into seminary that made me I had to go into an English because I mean they had me do line diagramming. I didn't even know what line diagramming was. I never even heard of it. They're like diagram this, and I just started drawing pictures. I'd never heard of it before, and but it was that English refresher course that really put things together. So because all of a sudden I started going, oh, that's how things work, and it really helped me kind of learn how to dissect text. So that's good that you're getting a chance to do it, even though I turned 50 a couple years ago, and it's you have to get the cobwebs out of there if you're all the way back into junior high, right?
Yeah. It's like I remember diagramming so long ago, and so yeah,
So
it's
you had
just
at least done it. I'd never even heard of it.
yeah, I did, but I mean it's and I have four kids. I mean, so like all the years of just like being in a totally different world, not in thinking about language or academics, and even when I was helping my kids in school, it was not the same thing. So,
How
um,
old are your kids?
my oldest is 27. That's my son 27, my daughter's 25, and then my middle son is 22, and my youngest son is 20.
We got them fairly close in there together. Yep.
Yeah, and the younger two are still at home. My middle son, who's 22, and he has autism, but he is working, and we are trying to do all we can to support and help him to get into that place of independence, which honestly, if you have 20-year-olds, or in the 20s, it's like they all have their struggle. And so the two youngest right now are still at home. And my youngest just got his real estate license and is Mr. Entrepreneur and wants to start his thing or whatever. And my daughter's in another state, and she's actually going to start college online soon because she just finally decided what she wanted to do, and which had to do with like it's like wildlife conservation or something. I don't know.
Okay.
When she was a little girl, she'd go out in the woods and she would like drag a deer skeleton home. Like this was the kid she was. So I was like, this doesn't surprise me. It just took you a while to figure that out. And then my oldest son actually works for a church, like a mega church, where he's a content director. So he writes and researches for the teaching pastors, and they're actually in Turkey and Greece right now,
Wow.
doing
On
Paul.
a tour kind of thing.
Well, they're doing, no, they're actually working. They're actually filming, and they're doing research, and it's for some sort of series and in some sort of encounter. They're going to have a church, and it's all on Paul.
What church is it?
Crossroads in Cincinnati. Brian Tome is the lead pastor.
Are you in Cincinnati? Where are you in Ohio?
I'm in
Cincinnati?
Cincinnati. Yeah, we're in the Cincinnati area. Suburbs of Cincinnati. I guess we're probably, 25 minutes, 30 minutes from downtown.
Is that
Um,
home? Is that where you grew up?
Part where I grew up. I was born in southeastern Kentucky in Appalachia. And so I was first 3 years there, and then I was here until I was 15. And then, I left home at 15. So, and I ended up back in Kentucky, for my last 3 years of like high school. Mhm.
Okay. And then been in Cincinnati for how long?
Let's see. Well, then a little bit in Columbus, so middle of the state, and then down to Cincinnati since I was like 20, 19, 20 years old. Yeah, 19. Well, 18 going into 19. So yeah. And I'm 50 now. So
So if you are been in Columbus and just no pressure, but this is going to dictate the rest of this conversation. Are you one of these the Ohio State type fan people?
no,
You're
I'm
all
not.
right then. You're all right.
I witnessed the craziness, and I was
Yes.
not a participant. I saw people flipping cars, setting them on fire, not no when they lost a football game. I was like, I'm out. I'm not into that. So yeah.
I have friends that are Ohio State fans, and I find them very annoying. But I told the current friend who's a just diehard Buckeye fan,
Hmm.
you gave us a lineman that is protecting my quarterback for the Chiefs now, so I've become a bigger okay with this guy. So anyway, we get off on football, we'll be here all day. So talk to me about just I mean, in some ways, anything. But I did look specifically at your week 5, week 6 questions, which normally what I do there is I take kind of let you guys just post those and then I talk about them, which is partly why I'm recording this because I thought if we get in any of this, I might share some of this with the rest of the class if they want to. But I like your questions. So, do you have specific ones you're thinking through, or
I
you want
mean,
me to talk about those particular questions, or where do you want to start?
I think kind of relating to some of those questions, like I was going back over like Derek Flood which I did get the book because I decided I do need to read the book more than I felt like after just one chapter, I was like, I wonder what's in the rest. But about the Old Testament and how to read the Old Testament and beyond just the multiple voices, which I was like, oh yeah, I get like there's definitely multiple voices, the conversation, the minority voice. I guess I'm trying to understand with when he talks about there's the difference between the faithful questioning and then there's just the like basic like I guess it's like unswerving or something obedience.
Unquestioning
Yeah,
obedience. Yeah. Yeah.
unquestioning obedience. Uh, that coming from some of my background, I'm trying to imagine anybody being willing to say, oh, like we have to use discretion and decide what we're going to accept or reject from the Old Testament, like, with that example that he gave, for example, with Elijah, calling down the fire from heaven. And then James and John are like, hey, Jesus, let's just, and Jesus rebukes them. And so he's saying in that section that he said, like, that's an example of where Jesus expected his disciples to have discernment of, wait, like, we're not here to do that.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, I have never, again, I've not encountered anybody coming from, I didn't grow up in a church, but some of my earliest experiences are sola scriptura, Calvinism and Reformed theology, and the other Holy Trinity, which was Piper, Grudem, and Sproul. Okay. So it's like, okay, they would not have been like, oh yeah, sure. Let's just go and figure out what we're gonna, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So I'm trying to wrap my brain around that, just given my background.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a lot there, and if anybody watches this, I want to take a step back. One part of what I'm trying to do with kind of this idea of if because the weird thing is we all have to discern what we're accepting and applying from the Bible, right? We all do that. I mean, like, you're not concerned about what cloth, what type of yarn is your clothes, or you maybe observe certain days or you don't observe certain days. You certainly don't sacrifice animals, or if you do, we need to call somebody and turn you in. Like, there's so many things that are in the Old Testament that we just naturally go, no, we don't follow that anymore. Like you said, depending on our tradition, there's certain things that, like you said, that we think, well, I'm not even questioning that. That when someone comes in and goes, well, let's rethink that, then it feels like, oh, wait a second, are you saying I don't believe in the Bible anymore? Um, and so that's kind of what we're wrestling with. You're going into the deep waters, and so like when you start asking about divine violence and some of those things, which I realize Flood's book, if you actually read Flood's book, that's the question he's wrestling with, period.
Mhm.
I have you read that one chapter, not because I necessarily like everything that Flood says, but predominantly he's kind of talking about this idea of the Bible being multivocal,
Mm.
because that's one of the things that I find that most students, and myself included, when I learned it, no one told me that I had more of the, well, it's inspired, and inspired means dropped down out of heaven and landed on a leather bound King James only, on my coffee table kind of thing. And so therefore you just read it and it's God's voice and God tells you. And if he says kill people, well, okay. And then if later Jesus comes along and tells us not to, like, okay, well, maybe God changed his mind. I don't know how all that works. Like, we don't really ask those questions until you either encounter the question of it, or you take a class or something like that. So what I'm trying to do is to say, okay, how do you read the Bible for how it's like, I want to be able to go in the Elijah passage or wherever and be able to say, what did the original authorial community, what were they trying to tell in this story? But as I say in week one, that doesn't go far enough if you're a Christian. As a Christian, we are saying we are following the Christ, King Jesus. We want to follow him in all things, including how did he read the Bible? And every time I say, how did he read the Bible? if you paid attention in week 2, there was no such thing as a book. But you know what I mean? How did he read the sacred scriptures that we now have, collected into one book? And that was a very revolutionary thought for me. But understand, I've been teaching this course for like 20 some years, and it was about halfway through teaching this, a decade or so or more into this, that I'm like, I'd never even thought about that. Never really been exposed to the idea of a Christocentric reading of scripture. It was different people that started, I just kind of came across it, and it just started like, I felt like I had kind of that Emmaus Road experience. If I ever turned those notes that are supposed to be kind of your weird syllabus / notes that are kind of the precursor to a book, if I ever turned that into a book, chapter 1 would be on that Emmaus Road encounter, because those two individuals that met the risen Jesus on the road heard him exegete to them the scriptures, which in their case would be what we call the Old Testament, and it was all the things concerning him. They're reading that going, we hadn't even had that thought before. And when their eyes are open, they talk about their hearts burning within, because all of a sudden they realize that which they've been reading their whole lives, we're all pointing to him, and yet they didn't see it. Talk about some mysterious stuff in there. And so what I'm trying to do in this course is to say, if you're a follower of Jesus, we read the Bible through the lens of Jesus, but we want to be faithful to the original text as they stand. So that's why I talk about a forward backward reading. We read it forwardly, so wherever we are in the text, we can say this is what they were trying to wrestle with, communicate, and then we say, okay, now with that, how do we read it in light of the Christ? And that causes us to then, I don't like the way Flood kind of makes it an either or, where he talks about unquestioning obedience versus faithful questioning. And I don't really like that language, but it was the best I could find at the time to give somebody let's talk about the multivocal nature and the telos of scripture and those kinds of things. I think it's just more of one of those things that I talk about, that we read the Bible with Jesus, for Jesus, like Jesus, and through the lens of Jesus. And that questioning idea comes to say, okay, now in light of Jesus, how do we read these texts? How do we read it through his eyes? How do we read it through his lens? And of course, what that means is you got to be pretty saturated in the Gospels. And what would Jesus actually say about this? Does he actually speak to these things? Well, he doesn't speak about every passage. He does tell us, because they asked him, right? Most commandment. He takes you to Deuteronomy 6 and talks about loving the Lord your God with the whole of your being. And then he takes you to Leviticus 19 and says, love your neighbor as yourself. Notice he doesn't say, well, they're all equally and they should all be read the same with the same weight and the same authority. He says, Deuteronomy 6, Leviticus 19. Everything else hinges around that. Love God, love your neighbor. They find that profoundly revolutionary. It's just, again, not knowing your background per se, other than what you just told me, I also have found it to be quite provocative and painful. Because as I go out and try to show people, like, hey, this is how Jesus read the Bible, you get into this, like, so you're saying we don't all read the Bible and the whole Bible? And it's like, well, let's read it like Jesus. And now you're getting into traditions that feel like you're questioning the scriptures, when in reality, what I'm trying to do is to read them more faithfully. So yeah, that's a lot of background for some specific questions we can get into, but that's kind of what I'm trying to do. And the thing that I keep thinking about, talk about this, but we all would say the Old Testament. I mean, literally, the way Christians refer to it, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. In other words, we don't believe it was the final product. We don't believe it was the culmination. We believe it's doing this, right? It's pointing us somewhere that we say culminates and is fulfilled in Jesus, thus the new covenant, right? But yet oftentimes we treat it like it's the final product. we treat it like we go back and read it with the same weight and authority that we do the words of Jesus and the apostles. And the more I press into reading the New Testament, the more I realize what they are doing is reading their Old Testament and interpreting it for us. Reading it. I mean, how many times you read Paul and he says, "Thus was fulfilled as it says in the scriptures," or you read Matthew, "Thus was fulfilled." Like they're reading their Old Testament and saying, "This is how we interpret it in light of Jesus." But again, that's not something that we're learning most of the time in our churches. If we're learning it, it's just, oh yeah, Jesus is the fulfillment. And we treat it like the script Old Testament predicted something and Jesus fulfilled it. And that's not quite how that works. So yeah. Anyway, a lot of background there. So like to me about the specifics. What are in light of flood, in light of chapter 6 and some of the stuff like, or not chapter 6, but week 6, lesson 6, are there specific things that you're kind of thinking through?
You mean like specifically like specific scriptures, or you just mean
Well,
like,
or just specific questions? Because like I have your week 5 question. You ask kind of just about how do we see this, and then I'm looking at week 6, and you talk about what to accept versus what to reject, and like there's some specific questions in there. So
Mhm.
I, just trying to discern, like, are there things specifically you're wrestling with that you want to kind of ask that we can talk about, or
Well, I was thinking about what you're like and what you were just saying and what I was reading in here, and I know he's talking about violence. But I was thinking in terms of part of our, obviously the goal, I would think, for interpretation of why we're doing all of this is so that we can live it
yeah,
accurately and be made more into the likeness of Christ. So as we're doing this, and we're facing real issues that are going on right now in our churches, and I was thinking, I mean, right now there's a big old giant, I guess, split happening in the Anglican Church because they have a female archbishop, and then there's, everything's happening in the Methodists and Episcopalians. And anyway, there's all these different groups, these different denominations, and it's all about how they're interpreting certain scriptures. And when you're looking back and taking that, like you're saying, taking the gospels and you're saying, okay, I'm going to read these gospels for what was happening then and for those people at that time, but I'm also going to go back and I'm going to kind of through this new, this revelation of Jesus and these the apostles who were giving us an interpretation of the scriptures are going to go back and look at this now. Well, I guess what sounds perhaps like so scary, I'm not necessarily feeling scared about it, but I would say other people get very riled up
yeah,
about this, is that,
yes,
okay, well, now you're going to affirm things that we shouldn't be affirming, or, or now you're going to be allowing things and, that clearly, that those things are not actually, scripturally true. And so how I'm trying to figure out from right now, like, okay, so how do I go back and say, if I went and my husband and I are visiting an Anglican church right now. And
mm,
so it's like, how do we address now the issue of women in ordination? And when you're okay from looking at the Gospels and reading, Jesus's interaction with women, or what, and then the scriptures that Paul has written that always get pulled out, and it's like, okay, is there something like I'm looking at this from my current life, too, just going, okay, how does this actually work out when I'm reading these scriptures in this way, forward, then back through the gospel, through Christ. Um, and like you said, people aren't really talking this way. It's like if you say anything in the Old Testament is no longer somehow applicable. I mean, other than, as you said, animal sacrifice or not mixing your linen and your cotton or wool or whatever. It's like, okay, we've suddenly rejected the word of God and we're heretics and, so I'm trying, like, where's the middle? Where's the acceptable in between? I've thrown out the word that actually matters, and I'm becoming, going back to Hebrew roots or something. I'm going to start, continuing following the law or whatever. So where's
Yeah.
yeah.
There's no easy answer to that. I wish there were. My life would have been a lot easier if I could figure out the easy answer. Um, I would tell you, you're wrestling with the same thing the early church wrestled with.
Hmm.
I mean, that's what happened in Acts 10 and 11. I mean, scholars think that there'd been about a decade or so that had passed by the time you get to Acts 10 and 11. And by that point, the gospel had not gone to the Gentiles. Like it had
Hmm.
gone to the Ethiopian eunuch, but like it's still a Jewish thing, largely around Palestine, North and Syria. And then Peter goes up to pray the daily prayers, the Jewish prayers, and he has this ecstasis. You're reading the Greek now. He has this ecstasis, which is to literally stand outside of. He has an out of body experience where he sees this sheep let down of all these unclean animals. And here's this voice, take and eat. And of course, it takes him 3 times before he realizes maybe God's saying something to me here. And of course, then a Gentile comes and invites him into his home. The Spirit comes to the Gentile people, and then that opens the door for the rest of the book of Acts. But what we forget in that is that's basically 10 years, or roughly speaking, that they're still basically seeing Jesus as the culmination of the Old Testament scriptures. And we just need to kind of now say, okay, how does Jesus and the law go together? How do we live as a covenant keeping Jew with Jesus being the culmination of that? And then all of a sudden, Peter, then later Paul will, through the great revelation, come and realize that everything that the Old Testament is pointing to was for all the nations. Um, and so you're wrestling with the same stuff. Like, what do we do with this? Because at the end of that Peter exchange, he's wrestling with, do we keep kosher? All of these commands that tell my people what to eat, what not to eat. There's certain days that we are to observe versus not to observe, which is, by the way, what the issue of Romans 14 and 15 is. As Paul was talking to these Roman churches that he had not been to, there's Jewish believers, there's Gentile believers, they're in these house churches, and they're separating because the Jews are saying we need to continue to keep customs and law, and the Gentiles are like, silly Jews, we never keep this stuff. And so it's dividing the church, and Paul's coming in and giving them instructions as to what they should do to help overcome those differences, because he sees it's really not about what the Jews are trying to make it, but he's not also telling the Jews to not keep those things. Point being, Sabbath, kosher, sacrifices, um, I mean, Gentile inclusion or exclusion, circumcision. There's all kinds of things that are in the Old Testament that we actually don't keep today.
Mm-hmm.
There's just certain particular ones that we have made, what you want to call it, a hobby horse, a pet doctrine, or we've kind of incorporated into and say, well, the Bible says, and therefore when someone comes along and says we don't do that, then that one becomes, and divine violence is a big one. Women and women's roles and those kinds of things, homosexuality, some of those are big ones that I wish we could all sit down and actually have a conversation about and say, okay, how do you interpret it? Where do you get that? Here's how we interpret it. I have just found that that's not what people do.
Mm-hmm.
They draw lines and throw stones. It's a lot easier that way. And what you're wrestling with is saying, I want to know, what do I do? How do I wrestle with these things? And that's something that this class will put you on a journey towards, but probably won't solve them all. As frustrating as that might be. Now, that's not my way of saying I'm not willing to talk about them. Um, I've pondered opening the door to some kind of like weekly reading the Bible with Jesus kind of group. I don't know where he could just come in and say, all right, I was reading Leviticus 19 the other day. What do we do with this in light of Jesus? By the way, speaking of Leviticus 19, into your question, Scott McKnight, I don't know if you've ever heard of Scott McKnight.
First name,
Um,
yeah.
he has a book on reading the Bible called The Blue Parakeet. And
Okay.
in his, yeah, I think it's in the class notes as recommended book. And one of his chapters, he says in his class, he gives an exam. It's like a quiz that he hands out to everyone. And he says, put a check mark by the ones we still keep to this day. And all he's doing is taking Leviticus 19 and all the commands that are there. And he says, every semester, they may be marked 2. But what they don't realize, unless they're, is the quiz he's given him is just the commands of Leviticus 19. You can do that tonight. Just go read Leviticus 19 and go, do I keep that? Do I keep that? Do I keep that? But Leviticus 19 is what Jesus quotes from when he says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. When everyone goes, well, yeah. So why do we choose that one versus the other ones?
Mm-hmm.
Jesus? Is it not the early church? Like they told us what to keep, what not to keep. And there is a movement that is starting to say, okay, in light of reading the Bible with Jesus, in light of Jesus, how do we then think about some of the more thorny issues like divine violence and some of those kinds of things that I tend to not, I mean, I guess I tread in those waters because I give that article or that chapter by Flood, but I try to stay away from it because that's a little bit more advanced hermeneutics kind of stuff. But I'm certainly willing to talk about it too. So yeah,
Well,
yeah,
it's what's literally causing division right now. So it seems like it's like there's not a I feel like to participate in the conversation as you're talking about, to participate in community, and actually that's a big thing that I've been trying to understand. I have started reading scripture with the church fathers, and the idea of the idea of like studying the Bible communally. It's not meant to be an individualistic or Lone Ranger
yes,
venture. And so like given that and what happened after Charlie Kirk's murder, and there's this sense of it's like there's two ways to go. We could just be enemies, which is obviously against what Jesus told us to do, or we can sit down and have the conversation and be going into the word together as a community. So it's just like it seems like there isn't a choice to just kind of be like, well, that's some tough issues, like, but I mean, that's where we're at. I mean, we have to
yeah.
like, I'm trying to like, how would I sit down with people and go through that? I mean, as we meet in small groups, or or we just talk to family, or like, how do we sit down and do that as I'm taking a hermeneutics class, as I'm taking a Bible study method class? Like, okay, how do we approach these things? Because even though it's advanced, hermeneutics, as you're saying, like it's an advanced, it is where we're at, because it's like people are expecting you to take sides. And
Well, and that's the difficulty is, I could say it like this: Jesus didn't take sides. Jesus did defend the marginalized, the ostracized, the hurting, the broken, the oppressed. So in some ways you could say, well, he did take sides, but it wasn't sides like he hated the Pharisees and he's over there. It's no, everybody should be lifted up. And what you're doing is oppressing. You're using your religion, you're using your scriptures to oppress those who are hurting. Like, here's an example. And this, I probably shouldn't use this, but like at the end of the day, think of it like this. To engage people in the conversation about how do you interpret certain passages related to the issue of homosexuality. I think it's an interpretational issue, which then comes back to your hermeneutics. And I'm willing to sit with someone as long as they're willing to do it in kindness and love and engage with people on that. But at the end of the day, I think even if you come out on a hard line traditional stance on that, how are you going to treat of people?
Mhm.
So you can have this the Bible says, and you start and treat them like dirt or like subhuman, think you're taking a hard stand with the Bible, I would suggest you've missed the very heart of Jesus, period.
Mhm.
And it's just, so to me, it keeps coming back to, are we going to read our Bibles like Jesus? Are we going to actually look at how Jesus interpreted the scriptures?
Mhm.
Like the John 8 passage. I understand maybe that wasn't there, but it ended up in our canonical scriptures. I think it was probably oral tradition that was added in, but that's fine. Is it ended up in our canonical scriptures? We believe it is part of the God breathed scriptures. And the religious leaders were right.
Mhm.
This person had been caught in adultery, and the Old Testament said, stone him. Now, there's problems with it. Where's the dude? Because it takes two to tango, right? Why they bring the woman and not the guy? I mean, there's all kind of patriarchal kind of things going on there. Jesus reenacts the Jeremiah passage and reaches down and starts, kind of, writing in the dirt. And then he stands up and says what he says, that he who is without sin cast the first stone. He's disarming a mob of people, because that's how you do it, right? Notice it's not one guy coming with a stone, it's a whole mob of people. And the text very clearly says, beginning with the older to the younger, they dropped their stones and walked away. To me, that's reading the Bible a particular way. If I could say it like this, forwardly, he's recognizing, yes, the Old Testament law commanded this. Also, the heart of the law was the good of people. And this person has been caught in sin. And what did he do? He showed love, he showed mercy. But then when he meets with her and says, where are your accusers? Where are your Satans, if you will? And she says, they're not here. He says, but I don't condemn you either. But then he also says, go and sin no more. Right? He's
Right.
not just willy-nilly saying, go do whatever, because at the end of the day, the heart of the scriptures are for the restoration and renewal, redemption of humanity out of the problem of sin and death. So it's not
Right.
just willy-nilly, but like I find people take a hard line and say, the Bible says, even if they're right, saying yay or nay on that, because I think it's a pretty complicated issue. But like, even if they're right, when we look at Jesus, what did he do? He didn't condemn. He didn't beat you over the head with this. He didn't cast you out. He didn't throw you out. So where do we get that? I think we get it from certain readings of the Old Testament. I think we get it more than anything. It's just from our traditions. And I think it just keeps coming back to, how did Jesus do this? How did Jesus read this? How did Jesus read the scriptures, and how did Jesus treat people? And to me, that's the guiding lens. It takes a lot of complicated stuff and makes it a little more simple. How did Jesus read it? And so now you're kind of centering your reading like in the Sermon on the Mount. Because in Matthew chapter 5, he does it over. You've heard that it said, let me tell you what I actually say about it. You've heard that it said, let me tell you what I say about it. And in the very divisive, complicated world in which we live, have ears that hear. And I say this to anybody who listen. If you'll listen, not very often, who are taking hardline stances, quoting Jesus.
Yeah.
Who are they quoting? Where are they quoting?
Mhm.
Right? They're doing
Yeah.
what you, since you use the example of the sons of thunder, Boanerges, they're wanting to drop fire out of heaven. And Jesus is going, you don't know what spirit you're of.
Mhm.
And so I just go, if you want to make it simple, we keep coming back to, how did Jesus read it? How did Jesus read it? And if somehow or another you can justify from Jesus why you're doing what you're doing, then at least we're on the same playing surface. I just find that most of the time when people are taking hardline stance about stuff, they're not quoting Jesus.
Mhm.
Man, you tell me, do you find that? because you're talking about it's a pretty complicated world we live in. Do you hear them quoting Jesus very often in those moments?
No, no, I do not. And I also notice very little listening or no listening. And really there's not any, like, there doesn't seem to be a priority put on any kind of compassion, of just to understand and to just have compassion. Because I don't think we can look at Jesus and say he wasn't compassionate, like he didn't have compassion for every, I mean, there was points where he literally like was just looking at people and they would say, and the rich young ruler looked at him and loved
Mhm.
him. I mean, I'm just like, okay, how many times did Jesus just, he looked at Jerusalem and wept,
He's
because he,
hanging with spikes in
Mhm.
his hands.
Yes. Hmm.
Says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know
Hmm.
what they're doing. And
Yeah.
that one gets me because I think I apply that and think, showing me that kind of mercy.
Hmm.
But then,
Yes.
but other people don't get mercy because, yeah. Anyway, I'm going to get myself
Yes.
in trouble here.
I agree. I mean, and just physically, even what he had to do to take the breath to be able to say that is, if you know anything about human anatomy and physiology and how crucifixion works, um, I mean, that's just tremendous to think about what he physically had to do with his body, even to do that, to
Mm-hmm.
say that, because it was important to say that. Not only that, but the thief next to him, today you're going to be with me in paradise. Again, what pain that, and like that added to the pain he's already feeling, just to tell him that. So yeah, I think when I'm listening to the conversations, and like you said, and they're not really even conversations, it's more like people just saying, I'm right. And but when I'm listening to that, I'm listening for, or I'm looking for listening, and I'm looking for compassion, because I know that Jesus listened, and I know that he had compassion, and that's something we
Yeah,
have when we're in a conversation. And so trying to look at um, those aspects of how Jesus interacted with people. Um, and I mean, I often think of when Jesus said, it says, or no, yeah, he didn't come into this world to to judge it, or he didn't come into the world to condemn it, but to save it. Um, and
only the very verse right after John 3:16.
yeah. Yeah, it
I
was
mean that
just,
you are literally quoting John 3:17, which I have I quote that all the time. Like
mhm,
the most famous verse in the Bible
mhm.
right after it is, I didn't come in the world to condemn the world, but that the world through me might be saved.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And then he keeps going, which is even more pertinent as he goes on. But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, okay, if I keep that in front of me, then I need to recognize um the things that, like you said, I could be right about something, or in the technical sense, and I'm, technically speaking, we know what sin is, or we can, but it's understanding I also stand in that condition. So it's just understanding ourselves, and not, it's the humility that's required, I guess, that's
absolutely.
hard to find. And I think about the fact that the first ones who dropped the stones were the older ones. I'm like thinking, well, yeah, like they were think about it, hopefully to some level they had more wisdom than the younger. And also certainly more, I think the older you get, the more you recognize, like,
The more they look back and go, I've got some stuff to look back on. Yeah.
well, and what you don't, the more, at least for myself, the older I get, the more I realize I don't know anything. I mean, I don't. And even though I'm seeking to understand and to have knowledge, but I really, the more I seek, it's like, yeah, I don't really.
What you are talking about, and I think it's a movement of the spirit where we're being confronted. Sorry, my daughter just texted me, so I just saw that text there. Um, we're being confronted with the spirit of certainty and learning to embrace mystery.
Mhm.
Like in the Enlightenment world we come from, it's everything needs to be defined, objective, certain. And that's not to say that we're not to know,
Mhm.
right? But it's understanding that, like you just said, we don't know everything.
Mhm.
We just worship and believe in the one who does. And we're okay to sit with that uncertainty and live and press into that mystery. And yes, we want to know. And yes, we can have deep conversations about theological stuff and wrestle with it. We just don't take sides and take up arms with each other over it.
Right.
I talk about reading the Bible with Jesus. I talk about reading it for Jesus. I talk about reading it like Jesus. I talk about reading it through the lens of Jesus. The other one I keep throwing out there these days is reading in the spirit of Jesus,
Mhm.
which brings in the role of the Holy Spirit and just this idea of the very breath of God, the very wind of God, the Spirit of God that hovered over the waters of the creation, who came to the early church on Pentecost when they read the scriptures in light of the Spirit of Jesus. Paul would say it should produce the fruits of love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, goodness, humility, and self control. So somehow or another, I'm reading the scriptures and it's not making me more loving, more kind, more good on down the line. I'm
Mhm.
missing something there. I'm
Yeah.
missing something there. And so what am I holding up? I'm right.
Right. Mhm.
Getting into knowledge. Like knowing isn't just an intellectual reality in the Hebrew mind. Knowing is living in light of that which you have received and understand. And we can know something, meaning like we have intellectual assent to something and not live it.
Mhm.
Hebrew understanding of knowing. We haven't got there in James, but you'll see that in James 1. When we do some exegesis Jesus there, he uses the word knowing. And it's the idea because you know from experience,
Mhm.
right? That it's this idea that it's that which life teaches you, like you were talking about when you have some age behind you. It's that which life has taught you versus just intellectual assent to something. And
Mhm.
you're part of an Anglican tradition, or at least you're,
I'm looking at it.
yeah, whatever you're, yeah. And the Anglican Church understands the idea of the mystery of God,
Yeah,
which
that's why I'm looking at it. Yeah.
have you ever read the book Evangelicals on the Canterbury Trail?
No. Mm-mm.
There's a book out there called I think that's what it's called, Evangelicals on the Canterbury Trail, which is talking about how so many evangelicals are turned to Anglicanism.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's someone on YouTube that he always is, what's his name? Jordan Cooper. He's a Lutheran pastor, and he's always like, "Why is everybody becoming Anglican and not becoming Lutheran?" And he does a whole he does his whole channel just teaching reformed theology, but from a Lutheran perspective. And he does a great job just really deep diving into Lutheran, the Book of Concord, all that, But I, coming from Presbyterian, Reformed, Tulip, Calvinist, that for a while, and even some Doug Wilson in there. We went into some of the I know, really, I know. Listen, it wasn't my choice, but at the time. But then, getting away from that and then diving into some more charismatic, um uh yeah, more charismatic, um tradition. I mean, I can't call it tradition, charismatic practices, and realizing that, you can go too far. You can either be constantly seeking to be right and seeking the knowledge, and I know everything and I know what I know, and therefore, and I'm like, in almost like it's everything's about the debate and proving rightness to, and also intellectually, like having again that sense of superiority of what intellectually. And then to the charismatic side, you can go so far to where it's all about the supernatural. It's just seeking the supernatural experience. And it's like, well, you know, why are you seeking that? Because
Yeah.
some of those things ways that you're trying to seek it are very clearly not of God. And so you're not actually, like not having the wisdom or the discernment in those areas, often because of lack of biblical um, knowledge. So it's kind of interesting to have these two places and going, okay, where is the we can appreciate the mystery, as you're saying, that they're, the super. I am not a cessationist. When I was in a church that was cessationist, I actually got in trouble because I got chastised because by elders because I suggested the women's book club read The Heavenly Man, and we did. And the pastor's wife shows up to our meeting and it's like, oh, what did everyone think of the book? And the pastor's wife, well, it's very interesting if we actually believe this, and so it was like, oh, that's right. Everybody here doesn't believe in
Mm,
miracles or
mm,
supernatural acts of God, but I'm like, I believe it. I believe it. That's, especially in the persecuted church. So anyway, it's just recognizing that, there's a place, there's a place for the things of that we can't understand, which is
yeah.
hard for our in the Calvin Reformed, but also we don't go playing in some things that we shouldn't be playing with, over in the charismatic side.
And you know what's interesting about both of those, and I certainly come out of a reform background, at least in my theological education, not in my heritage, but in my theological education. As much as those two theologically don't see eye to eye, I find they both what actually from the larger narrative of the scriptural story. So in week 7 of this course, we talked about reading the Bible as a story, and I talk about it being the framework. And I find in both cases have that framework. Not completely, and I understand I'm making broad generalizations, but I can only speak more to my experience in the Protestant Reformed type of world. There's a lot of know the catechism, we know the doctrinal statements, we know what we believe because, and they'll say the Bible says, but it's actually not taken within the larger narrative. It's propositions that have been pulled out and then read a particular way. And, much of our charismatic Pentecostal brothers and sisters are doing the same thing. They're just quoting little verses here and there, but it's very unhinged from the larger narrative. And as soon as you get kind of that, what I call it, creation, fall, redemption through restoration into new creation kind of lens, that becomes kind of the narrative or the framework in which you read it. You begin to realize, oh, it is all going to where the Bible actually ends. Behold, he is making all things new. From the garden on, he's creating this beautiful world of which when the fall comes in, he immediately comes in to heal it, to restore it, to make it new. And we just keep kind of turning away and moving into exile and going further and further in that. But yet he's continuing to woo and to call and to covenant back into that. I just find both of those traditions aren't really following that larger narrative. And
Mhm.
they're both very difficult in their own way to engage that narrative. My Pentecostal charismatic brothers and sisters, they're having all kinds of experiences, and you're going, well, the larger story, and they're like, well, experience, and they're quoting verses, but my more reformed brothers and sisters are pretty hard line on what they know,
Mhm.
and as you were saying a second ago, I'm somewhat drawing a conclusion from what you said a second ago. But fidelity to Jesus is doctrinal decision and fight and faithfulness. We got to hold the line clear so that we can stay within with Jesus. And I just go, boy, it is missing much of the Jesus narrative. Now, if
Mhm.
anyone is watching this later and you come from that tradition, I'm willing to have a conversation with you about that. I'm not condemning you or trying to throw stones. I just would say, again, it's what we're talking about. Keep coming back to Jesus, like the actual Jesus, the Jesus of the canonical gospels, the Jesus that is proclaimed in the New Testament letters, the Jesus of the book of Revelation, and keep coming back to that Jesus that you can meet in contemplative practices that will ground you deeply in reading the Bible in more of the spirit of Jesus. Yeah. One thing I wanted to throw out there, because you kind of asked the question, like, how do we know? How do we discern this? And there's no real, it's, I'll openly admit it's a weakness of this class. You'll get to the end of the 15th week and go, I'm still not sure I know exactly how to do this. And it's something that I want to make stronger as the class goes on. But I think it takes a very contemplative approach. And that's why I talk about reading the Bible with Jesus. Because in so many ways, the question is, well, how do we know? It's like, well, in some ways, you have to almost sit with every passage. What passage are you reading? And say, okay, now we're read it forwardly. We've interpreted it in its historical, cultural, literary context. We understand it both from an inside perspective. We'll get to that later. Like we're looking out the window and seeing it in its culture, kind of looking in the window and kind of letting it see it's in its culture. But then we also realize it's actually speaking to its culture too. So it's shaped and formed by its culture, but it's also speaking back into its culture. It's critiquing it. It's showing the problems of its culture. Once we understand that, then we say, okay, now we read it in light of Jesus. Well, what passage is it? How do we sit with that? What would Jesus say about it? And so to me, one of the examples I use is like, was it 1 Samuel 15? That's one of the more violent passages. You know, I just tell people, pull up a lawn chair and sit there with Jesus. I don't know why it's always a lawn chair. It's just my image, okay? It's just what it is. But just picture yourself sitting there with Jesus and say, what would Jesus say about that?
Mm.
And like breathe the air he's breathing, try to think the thoughts he's thinking. And again, I realize that takes us back to like really having to be grounded in the text. But do you see Jesus sitting there going, heck yeah, slaughter them, the women and children too? Or
Yeah.
here's an even easier example. One of the most famous stories in the Old Testament, probably the one I liked the most as the kid, was the David and Goliath story.
Mm-hmm.
David is celebrated in many of our traditions as the hero that slayed the giant. You know, you've heard the sermons, and it doesn't take much, 5 stones, and God can deliver, and all of that. And yet, I read that in light of Jesus and go, do you think Jesus was pleased that Goliath was slain?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, somebody listening to me say that right now, that might be a triggering statement to them. They might go, yeah, because it's in the Bible. But I would even suggest that may not even be a great faithful reading.
Mm-hmm.
That might not even be a great forward reading of the text,
Mm-hmm.
much less if you read it in. And so here's what I mean by that. When you read the Samuel and Chronicles account of David wanting to build Yahweh a temple for him to dwell in, right? What we call the Davidic covenant, when God comes and says, no, it's going to be your offspring, and I'm going to, your offspring, your son, he will be like a son to me. He will be your offspring, but he will be a son to me, and he will be the one that builds it. And I'm going to make his kingdom an eternal kingdom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why from those texts do they say God would not allow David to build that temple?
The blood on his hands.
Isn't that interesting? So if you
Mm-hmm.
really, really sit with that, it's like, okay, God was going, good job,
Right.
David. Way to kill all your enemies. But now that you've done that, I'm not going to let you build me a temple.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You have to at least, if you're reading that forwardly, you have to at least be honest with the contradiction that's happening there.
Right.
God's requiring it on the one hand and then condemning him for it on the other.
Mm-hmm.
That's confusing at least. Or
Yes.
maybe it's giving us insight into what God really thought about David's bloody battles and victories. And then I go, okay, so today, would we say that we think God wants us killing our enemies? Now, I understand that some people's answer to that would be, well, as long as it's our enemies, right? But like, should Israel be doing what Israel's doing? I mean, now you're talking about stepping into a massive political landmines. But at the end of the day, like, I'll make it more personal. If on this video I said, Angie, determined that God spoke to me and he told me to go kill an enemy, I would like to think you'd be calling the police before this conversation was over. I have determined that this person is wicked as sin, and I am going to go eliminate them because God told me to do that.
Yeah.
And you would be saying to me, Professor Doug, no, he didn't. But if it's in the Bible, somehow or another, magically, it's okay.
Right.
So
the
I tell
assumption
people
everything in the Bible is right. If it's in the Bible,
that's
it's
the
right.
assumption, right? That's the assumption, is that if it's in the Bible, it must be from God. I would suggest from week 2 on, I've made the case that that's not even a faithful reading of the Bible, because the Bible wasn't just dropped down out of heaven and land here and, oh, God said it. It's this divine human, where they were coming to know their God and they were writing about their understanding of God. And so, like, if I took and I said, Angie, God told me, and I wrote this down, in 100 years from now, someone picked it up in a book and said, that Doug Main believed that God told him to do that, you would say, well, yeah, that's what he believed God told him to do. You wouldn't say God actually told him to do it. But somehow or another, if it's the Jews of the Old Testament, we don't say, yes, this is what they believed God told them to do in their very ancient Near Eastern tribal deity way of thinking about God. We would say God told them to do it. And I would suggest that many of us are going, well, as we have come to learn how they understood God in their culture, that was more of their understanding. But how did they write it down? They didn't write it down, we believed God told us to do it. They wrote it down, God said. We pick it up and say, well, God said, instead of coming to understand that that's how they believed God told them. We haven't got to the Abraham incident in the course yet, have we? With Isaac, we'll talk about that in this course, right? Abraham genuinely believed that God was telling him to go sacrifice his kid. I don't know of a soul that would take this class that would believe that God would tell someone to do that. And yet somehow or another, because it's in the Bible and God says, and so what they would say is, well, yeah, but God knew he wasn't going to actually have him do it. Abraham was thinking. So Abraham believed that God told him to go do this. Suggest, and you're getting I'm getting ahead of myself, but I would suggest that what those texts are actually doing is showing that that's not what God is like. The shocking part of that story to the ancient Near Eastern reader wouldn't be that a God told them to sacrifice their firstborn son. The shocking part of that was that the God stopped him from doing it. And what you're getting at is the beginning of God going, I'm not pleased with sacrifices. Animal, human, anyway. But that's tough. Well, anyway, I'll stop there. That's tough because that's a rereading of that text that I would suggest is actually faithful to what the
My headphones just died. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I would suggest that that's actually faithful to what the text was actually saying and consistent with how Jesus would interpret it. So you're getting into this dual-edged sword of, if we read it forwardly, much of how we would interpret that, if it's read in light of how they actually thought about it, maybe contradicts some of the ways we interpret it. And then Jesus comes along and shows us how we should have been interpreting it all along. I find those two things to be consistent, not conflicting.
But it's hard because we are taught traditionally God actually said those things.
Yes.
So God said those things, and that's who he is. And so, yeah, Abraham was just, look how obedient Abraham was to take the steps up the mountain and trusting God. So we're assuming he's trusting God when it doesn't even say he's trusting God. But yet you know what I mean? It's kind of like interesting as you say that. And also like it makes me think about like prophets like Jeremiah. I was reading from Jeremiah today, and it's that whole like, I don't know if you're familiar with the daily office. I'm assuming you are, for like Anglicans, which I'm just now becoming familiar with. But there was a lesson in it where Jeremiah, or no, it wasn't Jeremiah. It was I'm thinking of Isaiah. Isaiah was talking, about like the bile coming out of his mouth with seeing the death and the destruction and, of babies and children. So I'm sitting there, I'm reading this going, the bile. I mean, I'm thinking he's actually vomiting from the depravity that he's witnessing. And I was thinking about, and this is a prophet of God, and this is somebody who's speaking for God. So I was sitting there thinking, what if, like, we could actually see how God actually finds this repulsive.
Yes.
Like that's not just him going, God, this is a horrible thing and I'm vomiting. What if God is actually repulsed? Because I realized I've never read that way, because again, that wasn't anything kind of presented. But I mean, since now trying to think through these things, I'm going, oh, what if that's God's response through Isaiah and Jeremiah, the ways that they were describing their actual physical, even the physicality, of, I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen anything that made you sick to your stomach, but I mean, like that, he was literally vomiting. So anyway, that was kind of a
And
thought.
you now you're reading it the way I think Jesus read the Bible. You're reading it in light of the prophetic tradition. And the prophetic tradition, which is what the Old Testament is doing, right? It's this ongoing conversation amongst the people of God, which is why it's multivocal, because they're presenting the various ways they understood things and they're engaging one another. The prophetic tradition was saying, how do we actually keep the covenant that God calls us to, which is love God, love neighbor? And quite often, I mean, this is the biblical story, right? They didn't. And when they didn't keep the covenant, what was always consistent about Israel? When they walked away from the covenant, what did they always turn to?
Their idols.
They always turned to their idols. They turned to another God. And in their idolatry, they turned to immorality and injustice, right? In other words, when they stopped loving the Lord their God, they stopped loving people. In many ways, I don't even have to call it immorality. I just call it injustice, because immorality we tend to put in the sexual realm, but that is a form of injustice, right? Where you are not treating another human being in a way that is reflective of love, right? And so it's and in that, I mean, you talk about, and so they become like the nations, where they become an incredibly unjust people because of their idolatry. So idolatry always leads to injustice. The lack of the worship of the true God always leads them to become a people that show harshness, cruelty, power, control, domination, etc., because they were trying to become like who? Like the nations. So like you said, the prophets come along and call them to that, and they're trying to bring God's perspective. Like you said, it's God's upset about that. Why do we think one of the tenets of the faith throughout the tradition is the immutability of God? God does not change, right? In other words, God does not mutate. He does not become something different. My daily Bible verse calendar yesterday, Hebrews 13, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, forever. The triune God does not change. So did he mutate from a very violent, I'm willing to kill anyone if you do things that come against my holiness, to a God who's like, nope, not going to kill him? What he's trying to do from the beginning is to solve the image bearers gone wild problem. And what did we immediately do when we were made in the image of God, when we turned to the knowledge of good and evil? What becomes the foundation of the world in Cain and Abel is violence.
Mhm.
And that violence that we turn to, if we could use another word, that wrath that we turn to, we then in turn impose and think God is like that. And I would suggest that the scriptures from the beginning are trying to show God's not like that at all. That's our problem, not his problem. We think
Mhm.
God is like that because we're projecting our anger and our violence and our stuff on him, when in reality he's trying to show us he's the opposite. He's the one that has bile coming out of his mouth at the profound level of injustice. And if you say, well, Doug, I don't know, that seems like a pretty crazy reading of the Old Testament, well, keep going. When we get to the one that the gospel writers say is God in human flesh, when we get to the one that John 1 says that no one's seen God at any time, but the only begotten who's in the very bosom of the Father, the one who's exegeted God, the one who's interpreted him and made him known, the one that when the disciples ask, when Philip asks, show us the Father, he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The one who's the
Mhm.
exact image of God, Hebrews, the very image of God, 2 Corinthians 4, the one who is the very exact um, image of God, Colossians 1 and 2. In him dwells all the fullness of deity in bodily form, Colossians 2. What he embodies is love,
Mhm.
nonviolence, peace, seeking the good and restoration of all people. The one who didn't come into the world to condemn the world, but came into the world to save the world. And
Mhm.
he's the one I follow. He's the one that I've said, I'm going to read that lens, even if it comes against your interpretation or your understanding. And I'm okay with that because I just go, well, I'm going to sit with Jesus. And at the end of the day, I say, Jesus calls me to love my neighbor, to just embody mercy and grace, to live at peace. And I stand before the judgment of God, and he's like, yeah, you were way too merciful. You know what, Doug? You were so freaking merciful. And he judges me for it. I'm like, oh, okay. You might hear the sarcasm that I don't believe that that's going to be the case. I think he's going to go, you didn't go far enough, buddy.
Mhm.
But that's what I keep trying to follow him into. And so the point of all of that long-windedness is that a faithful reading of what this multivocal text is doing is trying to point us, this is what God's been like all along. And what
Mhm.
Jesus comes and shows us is going, yep. But there is a way of reading the Old Testament that looks very different than that.
Mhm.
And Christian nationalism and all those kinds of people have found how to read that very, very well. And I don't even find they're reading it that well. I just find they just quote verses so they can uphold their agendas. And I'm not even that worried about offending people there because that just is what it is, right?
Right. But I guess, yeah, maybe what I'm thinking as you're talking, like how there's so much justified by saying that there's such a thing as righteous wrath or righteous anger, and we can have this righteous anger. So I see how people, because I think people have been confronted with how do you make sense of this, and then it's like what can we come up with to maintain
Yeah.
that this is okay?
Yeah. So as you're saying that, here's an example. Romans 12, the end of Romans, I mean, the whole thing, Romans 12, let love be without hypocrisy. Let it be genuine. Abhorring what is evil, but clinging to what is good. Like he is literally telling you at the end of it, chapter 13, here's how to fulfill the law, all in one word, love your neighbor as yourself, right? In
Mhm.
the midst of that, toward the end of chapter 12, and remember, there's no chapter titles here. He's writing a letter. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave
Mhm.
it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. I'm going to just say you and I. I mean it broader than you and I, but you and I might read that and say, yes, the wrath of God, vengeance is mine.
Mhm.
What makes me think that God's judgment is anything less than his love
Mhm.
But as soon as I hear vengeance or wrath, I immediately have a connotation that I think, that's right. I'm going to leave it to God. And by God, he's going to drop some serious anvils on their head. He's going to open up the earth and swallow them up. And if nothing else, he's going to throw them in a fiery pit for eternity. What's weird is the very next words out of Paul's mouth is, to the contrary, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Like, if you really, really, really stop and think about that, to hold to vengeance being God punishing, but we're supposed to be doing good. Like, we're doing good and God's doing some serious harm. That's a pretty stinking contradictory way of thinking about things. And I understand that I just now ventured into another thing, but like, we have to interpret things like wrath and vengeance in light of what the New Testament authors actually say, not what we want to do with them.
Right.
And that's hard. That's hard because now you have to rethink things. I'm constantly going, okay, you want to hold to the wrath of God, which I do. I want to hold to it in light of what Jesus and the apostles actually said about it. And you remember that John 3 passage, right? He didn't come into the world to condemn the world. He came into the world that through him the world might be saved. Because he actually then goes on and talks about, this is the judgment of the world. Here's Jesus himself, Lord and the Savior he is, telling you, here's the judgment. That light came into darkness, and men loved their darkness because their deeds were evil. There's God's judgment. He sent light, and man said, nope, we don't want light, we want darkness. In other words, there's God's judgment. There's his wrath. There's his, whatever metaphor you want to use to describe that. God's judgment is not a retributive thing. It's man receiving the consequences of not stepping into the love that John 3:16 talks about. And it's the same thing in Romans chapter 1. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. And what he describes is humanity pursuing sin and God giving them over. He doesn't describe retributive justice. He describes mankind receiving the consequences of the error of their ways, which I'm literally just quoting Paul. So when he talks about wrath, he doesn't talk about anvils and the ground opening up. He doesn't even talk about fiery pits, and he talks about humanity in their subhumanity moving into greater and greater and greater sin.
So humanity's rejection of him, not his rejection of them.
That's correct. That's correct. So the point of it all, if I could summarize it, is if I could bring it back to hermeneutics, reading it faithfully, particularly the Old Testament, is to say, what did they actually say about this in its context, which may actually be very, very different than how we would interpret it if we actually took the time to interpret these things instead of just picking a verse here and picking a verse here and quoting it. And then reading it, what I call backwardly in light of Jesus, really is going to challenge us. And yes, there are times that Jesus, yep, that's how my Jewish brothers and sisters interpreted things, which is not how I do it. And if that's controversial, it's only controversial, not because Doug Main's quoting it, it's because Jesus did it. To me, the one that was the most difficult when I read it when I was young is Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount. Because most of those I could go, yeah, he's just going against their oral tradition. But when he says, you have heard that it's said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you, he is literally quoting the Old Testament law. And he goes, that's not how we follow it. We're not following an eye for a tooth for a tooth. That's how Moses interpreted it. That's how Moses came to understand what Yahweh was saying. That's what he gave his law. That's not how we're doing it. And that is really, really, really difficult for people to come to terms with unless you're really saying, I'm going to read the Bible through the lens and like Jesus. And it's just tough. And so to your question in week 6, how do we know? Like, I just think you have to sit with every one of these passages, wherever it is, and interpret it, and then go, okay, now in light of Jesus, And then I think that's where community comes in too, where we can have conversations like this and go, what do we do with this one? What do we do with this passage? That's tough. And sit with it. And I mean, I used a couple of controversial examples today, but like it's hard to hear that the prophetic tradition might have actually been showing the problems of that came upon Israel because David chose to kill instead of follow Yahweh's covenant ways. But that's why when you go to week 2, when they break up the Tanakh, right? The second part of that is the prophetic tradition. And Joshua, Judges, right? Samuel, Kings, they're all a part of the prophetic tradition that is actually speaking to their history. If I could say it like this, it's critique, it's telling their history, but not as an investigative reporter. It's critiquing their history and saying, how well did we do in keeping covenant? That is, okay. Can I be very controversial? That's a very non-American thing right there.
Yeah.
America likes telling their history through a very tainted lens instead of saying we need to be honest with our history and embrace the good and repent of the bad. We want to uh, gloss over that. That's what superpowers do. That's not
Yes.
what Israel did. That's why I talk about reading it from a minority perspective, because that's what the prophets are calling them back to. You are not a major people, you are a minor people. So stop trying to be like them and start following Yahweh to what he's trying to lead you into. And I think that's a very faithful way of reading the Old Testament. And more importantly, as Luke 4 and other passages show, it's a very Jesus way of reading it. So now, I know, Angie, that might not solve the tensions of trying to figure it all out, but is you'll learn to be patient with yourself, because I too wish I could solve it. If I could solve it, I'd already have a book written.
Yeah.
It's these questions that I'm asking about, like, what do we do with these really complex things that make it difficult to try to communicate to other people? But I love the fact you're asking the questions.
Well, and on the other side of things, I think I referenced this, like people just slapping Jesus on everything. Kind of, there's the other extreme. And maybe, again, I don't want to sound like I don't want to group like every single person who follows a charismatic tradition, way, but maybe in some of those circles, kind of just like seeing, like, you know, like kind of putting Jesus on everything that isn't necessarily have anything to do with Jesus, So as kind of like when you said, we'll go backward and we're going to see Jesus. Well, I'm like, I guess I'm looking for the bumpers, at the bowling alley
Yes. Yeah.
that keep
It's a
you
good
from going,
analogy. So interestingly enough, my first exposure to a Christocentric reading, which actually kind of turned me off from it, was a very reformed guy.
Okay.
And he was very excitable and he saw Jesus everywhere. And he would go like, we got to read the Bible and it's about Jesus. And I'd go, yes, it is about Jesus. And then they'd say, and Jesus is everywhere. And so every passage that he read, somehow or another, he was trying to fit Jesus into it.
Yeah.
And as an exegete, I went, nope, that's not. You're distorting that text to try to somehow or another fit Jesus in here. And what ends up happening in those cases is you end up conforming Jesus into your own image and likeness. So the question you're asking is profoundly insightful. It's Jesus is not in every passage. And that's part of the spiritual discernment to say, where is Jesus? And so when I talk about reading the Bible for Jesus, that's not saying that we need to find Jesus in every passage. I already used an example today, like some of those violent passages, I go, I don't find Jesus anywhere near there. In fact, if I would be so bold, and I'm trusting my class to have enough discernment to understand what I'm saying here, but like I would say, Jesus is there, but Jesus is standing there shaking his head. Going, I don't support this. This is not a reflection of my Father. And I feel that in my bones because I'm a pretty passionate, straightforward guy, and I come by it honestly. If you meet my dad, my father-in-law says about my father, he may be the most tender-hearted person he's ever met. But if you ever around my dad, he's got this real strong, tough exterior. He's a banker, bank president for years. But the thing is, I knew my dad. I knew the love he had. I knew the kindness that he showed. But I also know he's like me. I've got a loud voice. He was always my coach, and he'd be fiery, and people would be like, "Why is your dad upset?" And I'm like, "He's not upset." And when they would say things about my dad that was not true, I'd get mad as a kid because they had a perception based on how they interpreted something that they in turn said, "But that's not him. I knew him." And so that's what I would suggest is like when you're reading the Bible, we don't find Jesus everywhere.
Okay.
What we do is try to discern where is Jesus. And maybe it's, as I said, maybe it's him sitting there and looking at the top of the hill going, this is not what the Father would ask Israel to do. And it's he's looking over Israel grieving. Why did you do this? Why did you go into this battle? Why did you subject more people to this bloody, violent way of going about things, i.e., the book of Judges? Which, by the way, I would suggest that's what the book of Judges is trying to show. They're not trying to put these judges up as heroes. They're trying to put it up and say, look what happens when you give yourself to violence. Violence begets more violence. And by the end of the book, you're just dripping with blood all over everywhere, right? Which is somewhat the opposite of how we interpret it, right? It's like, oh, look at these Samson figures that are heroes. And so you kind of have to sit with this and say, is Jesus there? What would Jesus say? Is he applauding this? Is he standing in grief on this? Is he nowhere to be found? And that's where the more you get into Jesus, the more you can see how he would interpret it. That's why I have you sit with that Luke 4 passage, because he takes two fairly obscure examples and points to this woman, this widow, and this Syrophoenician, the Syrian general, which by the way would be the captain of the enemy of the host of the enemy. He'd be the host of the army against Israel, and yet God shows him mercy and heals him. I mean, you talk about picking two passages that want to get you thrown off the side of a cliff as they want to, but that's what he's pointing to, what his father has been like all along. So that's what we try to do is read these texts in light of it. And so again, I think that takes patience. I think it takes spiritual discernment. I think it takes community of people who are on a common journey together. It's not a pressure that you have to put upon yourself, but I love the fact that you're at least asking those questions and trying to sit with it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, after so many different attempts to understand the Bible through different, I guess different frameworks, as you're talking about, it's like, and always coming to the same place of, this is not even what this is saying, yeah, I'm at this point, I'm just like, okay, I mean, how much time do I have left? I don't know. The clock's ticking, like how much time do I have to actually know this and understand it in a way I can live it out so that, I mean, I can say, yeah, I lived my life, how Jesus would want me to live my life. I can't do that if I don't know him and don't know how else am I going to know him, but be in the word and to see him there. So I have to figure this out. I don't know. I just feel like that's I don't know, show yourself approved, as Paul said to Timothy. But not in the sense of, like I was talking about before, of head, just look how smart I am, because I've memorized the Westminster Catechism or whatever. But it's like, I didn't know, you don't know when you're, and not coming from any church background. Having people value the Bible as the Presbyterians that I met did was so wonderful after coming from a place of where there was just, like a total disregard of God completely. So, and of no knowledge of the Bible at all. So, I can understand why people embrace Reformed theology and the feeling of certainty that it gives them. But when the rubber meets the road and you know, and I'll give a personal example. When my father was dying, I hadn't talked to him in 4 years. And so I realized I needed to go to the hospital and it's a very crazy story, but there was like a person that was taking advantage of him and was impersonating me at the VA. And I had to inform the VA, no, I know who I am and I'm not there, you know. And so I went, but I hadn't had any contact with him because of just the really horrific things that happened, you know, in the past with him. And I remember walking, I prayed the whole way there. I took someone with me and we're praying and praying. I walk in and I just remember, you know, the emergency room bay filling with just the presence of God and just the love of God. And it was just the love of God. It was just, and just a knowledge, you know, I heard through the Holy Spirit and, you know, you don't need anything from him because I have everything that you need. And it was just a really moment of just recognizing this isn't head knowledge. This isn't because I've studied tulip. You know, this isn't from systematic theology. This isn't from, you know, spirit travel or some other kind of really crazy charismatic, you know, whatever. I just was genuinely like, God, I need you. And I'm afraid and I need you in this moment, and God showing up and revealing that he's about love. You know, he just loves so deeply. And, you know, so in those last months of my dad's life, I was able to really be freed to genuinely love him. And I remember being with him as he was dying. And I mean, all I could think was, I wish I had loved more. I wish I had loved more and loved better, you know, like, because it was just like, because of how much love was present from the Father, you know, and being with me in that, it's like, okay, like that just, like, there it is, you know. It was kind of like, it's not a intellectual study, but at the same time, because of the things we encounter. And I think of Peter and his shepherd's heart and how he warned. I always say his last will and testament was a warning.
Yeah.
Don't fall for it. Don't fall for the don't fall for the false teaching. His heart to warn and want them to be preserved, their faith to be preserved, and that you have to know, not, you know, the Lord, but you have to know the word, and you have to, you know. So that's why I'm here to like truly integrate, like, okay, how do I know this, and how I not just get in my head, because that would be my tendency, because I was always the academic learning person, you know, so my tendency would just be go that route. Or I certainly can't go along with a lot of the charismatic you know, ways of contacting God. But I'm like, I'm just like, I need something to be rooted in, and have as the bumpers, as I, you know, said before, to how I can live out what God has done just in the love that he's shown me. So like having a framework like this is so critical to being able to do that.
Boy, that is so many things that was beautiful, like and tingling skin kind of stuff. I mean, what you just described of the love and presence of God with that you were given with your father. I mean, that is the summary of the contemplative tradition. Ancient, like it wasn't that they didn't have theology, but theology that was just what we call head knowledge that didn't somehow or another learn to experience God. And you use the word integrated in an integrated way. Um, what you described is profoundly beautiful. I mean, that's stuff you could write books on, kind of right there. And yet at the same time, you also use the word rooted. Like we want to be so deeply rooted in the knowledge of who this God is that we're not just shaken by anything that comes along. And so a little bit of an off subject. So I'm putting together a year-long certificate through the Jesus cohort that I lead that would be like 6 tracks, multiple courses. And that's every one of them asking the question, what role does X have in our spiritual formation? One of them is, what role does theology have? And it really is wrestling with this idea that true theology is found in Jesus. Jesus is perfect theology. So if theology is the study of God, and then what we're really understanding is this theology is that God is like Jesus. Always has been, always will be. Sometimes we've understood that, sometimes we haven't. And yet it's wrestling with, can we have theology that doesn't just turn to intellectualism? But can we have a theology that is so deeply grounded in the contemplative tradition that we don't just know it with our heads, it's something we experience? And you just described that so well in what you were saying of like, I want it to be integrated. I want it to be rooted. I want to be able to experience it. And yet I don't want it to just be experiential. Right. And that was profound. I think it's beautiful. Very, very well said. So I am looking at the clock. I'm going to have to go here pretty soon. Is there anything that I can just, anything before we get off here? And again, this doesn't have to be the only time we do this. We can meet again whenever it works for your schedule. And by the way, if anybody watches this later, it's the same thing. I'm here. Today was a chilly day. It's the first time in our new house that I actually have turned this on and sat by it. And right now I'm really, really hot. So I'm going to go turn this thing off here in a minute. But it was pretty dang chilly this morning. But I am here. Like I enjoy talking about this kind of stuff. And so, but before we get off here today, is there anything that you kind of like, boy, I sure want to make sure I ask this before we get off here?
I just the question on the assignment for observation. I started doing like line by line observation. Is that what you wanted for the discussion group, or did you want something more general for the discussion group? Because we're doing that for the one line by line for another assignment.
Remind me, is this the one where it's just James as a whole?
Well, it's James, but I just went right into line by line. I wasn't doing it as a whole. So is the discussion group assignment supposed to be kind of James as a whole? Was that what I was supposed to do for that? And
Well, I'd
then
have to remember which is because you have multiple, you'll be doing observations each week from the rest of the semester. And so the simple
oh,
answer is if I say observe James, I'm wanting you to give me observations of the letter as a whole, not line by line, because one, that would take you forever.
right.
We'll get into like observe James 1, 3 through 5, or 3 through, 2 through 12. Then you would go a little bit more line by line.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Depending, so if I say James, I want you to give me bigger picture. Like keep reading it, and what do you see in its structure and its emphasis and its themes and big picture kind of stuff. If I say
Okay.
observe this paragraph, then you go more line by line. And then people say,
Okay.
well, how do I do it? The thing I say, observation is you and the text, right? So I don't care if you draw, print it out and get multicolors and draw things. I don't care if you just, what I want you to do is just sit with those passages. The other question I'll sometimes get from people is, well, how much? Take time. I think about it more as how much time do you sit with it, and less about, did I get 3 pages versus 2 pages versus
Right.
150 word. It's just not how I think about it. You can kind of tell, has someone sat with this passage, or did they just try to get an assignment done? I don't think I'm going to be too worried about you trying to just get assignment done. You can tell you're really trying to sit with this. And so like sometimes maybe you just even set a clock. I'm going to sit with this for 20 minutes. Because if not, 2 hours might go by and you didn't feed your kids living at home food or something, like I was just so in this text, I forgot to feed you. They're in their 20s. They can feed themselves at this point, but you
Yeah, I
get
was gonna
the
say they can feed themselves.
idea.
Yeah,
Mom was
yeah.
too busy reading the Bible again. But you get what I'm getting at. Like,
Yes.
find ways that work for you and then just sit with it. And the other thing is,
Okay.
if you take notes where you're jotting down things, and find a way to organize it, because the next time you pick it up, if it's just kind of your brain, the next time you pick it up, you go, I don't know what I said here, because that's what you want to do. You want to have freshness every time, like you're reading it for the first time, even though you're not.
Okay.
And so just enjoy that. But to answer your question, if it's big picture, keep it big. If it's a passage, then you can kind of go more line by line and see details in it. Yep.
Okay. Okay. No, that
Yeah.
makes sense. All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate all your time.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks for initiating this. And again, I'm here. So if you want to do this again, just let me know.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Blessings. Take
Yes.
care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.